Good evening and welcome back to the Orkney International Science Festival online. This year sees the Orkney International Science Festival enter its 30th year, and we're delighted to be able to give you a full festival programme directly to you wherever you may be. It's my great pleasure this evening to introduce Alison McLure with her talk on seas around Svalbard. Alison McLure graduated in physics from the University of Aberdeen and went on to work at the Meteorological Office for 10 years. Here she researched and developed instruments for mountaintops and forecasting weather for the RAF, the BBC and the British Antarctic Survey. Alison then managed a yacht marina in the west coast of Scotland before returning to the city, joining the Scottish Executive Environment and Rural Affairs Department. Here she was seconded as a People Exchange Manager for the Scottish Leadership Foundation. Alison has a postgraduate diploma in Outdoor Environment and Sustainability Education and is a Fellow of the Royal Meteorological Society and is currently the Scottish National Manager for the Institute of Physics. We hope you enjoy Alison's talk following her second expedition to Svalbard. And if you have any questions, folks, please pop them into the YouTube live chat and we'll return to Alison to answer the questions after the talk. Now over to you, Alison.
Thanks very much. Well, I've been lucky enough as a physicist to travel to many places. And if we can share the slides, that would be fantastic. And one of the most amazing places that I've been to is Svalbard. And in this talk, and if we go on to the next slide, we shall chat about the seas around Svalbard, about Svalbard itself. It is a very scientific island, lots of science is carried out in there. And our expeditions, and I've been on two, where the main idea of them was to carry out even more science than has been done already on the islands. So lots of things to chat about. So we'll move on to the next slide and chat a bit further. A wee bit about Svalbard itself. It's an incredible place, an archipelago of islands, quite often known as Spitsbergen, and there's some discussion as to whether we should be calling it or not, but I'll leave that for you to look it up. But the name Svalbard itself means cold coasts and was first mentioned in Icelandic texts. And a large area of the islands offer lots of wild nature, old mines, so there's lots of human history in Svalbard, and a fair number of polar bears, and there are more polar bears there than there are people. And of course it's in the Arctic, so it's located very far north, even further north than Orkney, and quite a large area as well, the size of Ireland or so. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk a bit more about it. And the part of the reason we were there was to do science, and it has a lot of nature areas, 3 nature reserves, 6 national parks and 15 bird sanctuaries. So lots of places to be able to go and study the wildlife there. One of the things we weren't going to study was polar bears, but I'll maybe get on to that later on. But it has got a very mild climate, and as a meteorologist, of course, I was really interested in that. And part of the reason for that is that it's in the similar sort of Gulf Stream or North Atlantic drift that Orkney is. So for its latitude, it's actually surprisingly mild. Having said that, it has had lowest temperatures recorded of a minus 46 in 1986. I remember it was quite cold in Scotland in 1986 as well. I have good memories of going skiing that year. So hopefully we'll get some more cold winters along those lines, but not minus 46. That is quite hard to deal with really in terms of actually being out and surviving in it. So next slide. We're not And much of the science in Svalbard is done through various different universities and organisations. And we did a fair bit of our science in conjunction with some of the universities, because we were going to a fairly remote part of Svalbard, which meant that we were going to be able to get some fairly interesting information back from there that the scientists in the universities wouldn't necessarily be able to get hold of. And a place that you might be interested in is Svalbard's Global Seed Vault, which is also known as the Doomsday Vault. And that's a place where seeds from all over the world are gathered up and frozen in this place, so that come a big emergency, we should be able to go back and get the seeds and be able to plant them out. A couple of problems with that I wondered about were, well, first of all, with global warming, actually, it turns out that the seed vault was flooded and come above freezing, which people didn't expect at all when it was built. And the other one is, if there's a big, huge disaster, you do wonder how you'll be able to get to a place like Svalbard, because it's so far away. That said, I said before, it had been mentioned in Icelandic texts, so it just shows that the people of old had the skills to be able to get there. And certainly people from Orkney, like John Ray, had a history in Svalbard as well. Next slide, please. I mentioned there that the Doomsday Vault had been flooded, and that brings me on to climate change. And the rate of warming in the Arctic is much higher than it is elsewhere in the globe, well, maybe other than the Antarctic, but it is twice as high as the global average. And there's been a warming of 3 to 5 degrees observed in the last 50 years or so. That's very similar actually to the Antarctic Peninsula. That's been about 3 to 5 degrees as well. And that means it has, there's been a significant decrease in the sea ice coverage, and that really has given a positive feedback effect in that it's enhanced the warming. It's also had severe implications for the wildlife there, and in particular the polar bears. So moving on to the next slide. In the seas around Svalbard, which is where most of the polar bears spend most of their time, the warming will make a big difference, and the climate projection gives an average warming of about 1 degree Celsius. And that might not sound very much, but actually in terms of sea level rise, that is very significant. And it does mean that the sea ice, which is extremely important to the area, will decrease and have significant effects. So it's a real issue, much more pressing issue in the Arctic, having sea level rise, than it is for ourselves. Although ironically, although the sea ice will be going and the sea levels are likely to rise over most of the world, the lack of ice on Svalbard itself looks like it will mean that Svalbard will start to rise as well. So the joys of science, it's always quite complicated, and for one theory comes another unexpected consequence quite often. And the next slide. Which is part of the reason we wanted to really contribute to the science. And in the vein of sort of complications, you can see how water is such a fantastic molecule and thing to work with. Just even from this slide, you can see all the different formations it can have. This is on a beach in Svalbard with sort of mainly old snow on top of that, and ice that's been washed by the sea, and with the tide coming in and out. And if we move on to the next slide, this is a close-up of some of the patterns that were made by the water. And it just shows what an incredible thing it is. And part of our scientific progress was to be able to study some of the water on Svalbard in terms of water flow, ice flow off from the glaciers, and also glaciers themselves. So next slide, please. We also wanted to study some of the geology. On the second expedition I had, went on, we had a geologist on board, so it was great to be able to have their input and work out some of the processes that were going on. And the fact that there's not much vegetation in Arctic Svalbard means that the geology is a bit easier to study. Next slide, please. And of course, biology, it's a huge part of science in Svalbard. This is a ringed seal feeding her pup, and a very much a part of the food chain in Svalbard, an absolutely beautiful thing to see. And of course, the female seal there keeps the hole clear so that she can feed her pup, who's pretty vulnerable there, lying on the ice until the pup can actually start to swim and join her in the sea. Next slide, please. On land, there are a few mammals, but not very many, and this is one, an Arctic fox, and it's in its transition from transitioning from winter to spring. And during our expedition, we were actually there in the springtime. Moving on. And part of expedition life is about preparation. We had something like 30 people on the expedition. So imagine how many mouths to feed, and you're talking quite often some very hungry people on the expedition. So here we are sorting out all the various bits of food and equipment that we need, and also a fair bit of equipment to be able to move around in the Arctic, and also scientific equipment as well. So moving on to the next slide. And given that we'll be moving around different parts of Svalbard, we needed to be able to communicate. And this is our chief leader aide. He's sorting out, he was an engineer by trade, and he's sorting out our communications kit, a fairly large radio for base camp. And then we all had radios to take away with it as when we were off on our various different camps and so on. Next slide, please. And I mentioned food, that plays a big part in expedition life, if anyone has ever been on one. You're really banking on around 6,000 calories a day because you're burning up a lot of energy in the cold. And also quite a lot of the folk on their expedition were young men. Generally, they burn up many more calories than most of us. And it's a great chance to be able to eat lots of chocolate and lots of high calorie things that you might not be able to eat normally. And certainly with lockdown podge in the way, you wouldn't want to be eating many of these things because they really are designed to be good high calorie stuff. Strangely enough, when I was in expedition in the Antarctic for quite a number of months, actually the main thing we missed was fresh fruit and vegetables. So tell that to your adolescent children who perhaps aren't so keen on their vegetables. Next slide, please. I mentioned lots of equipment. Well, here's a small part of the stuff that we had to bring in to be able to do an expedition properly. On the slide, you can see skis to use to travel around. There are sort of sledge-like things in the background there that are called pulks, and poke bags as well on the right there, and there to carry the equipment and try and keep it dry. On the odd occasion it might rain. We actually went there in April to make sure it was proper cold, but with plenty of light as well. And actually by using skis and pokes, it's a much easier way to move around than it is during the melt, where things become quite difficult. Next slide, please. And of course, being there and being very remote, we had to pay attention to make sure that we had plenty of first aid kit. We actually had 2 doctors on the expedition, and all the expedition leaders like myself are trained up in at least first aid, and quite often a little bit more advanced first aid. But we mainly relied on the doctors to be able to administer anything that happened. Luckily, having a young, fit crew, most people were healthy, and we really only had a couple of medical things that we had to deal with. And I've been lucky so far, most of the expeditions I've been on, that we haven't had to deal with too many emergencies, but you never can be too, you have to be better safe than sorry, and make sure you've got the kit for it. Next slide, please. Yes, I've mentioned food, and it is quite a big thing. We have various ways of cooking up, usually using fuel, and we did actually have a bit of a problem with getting the right fuel there. And it meant that we had to use our chief leader's main skills of engineering in cleaning up the stoves because the fuel wasn't that brilliant. And we all became quite expert in cleaning them up. But MSR stoves are great multi-fuel ones, and for melting snow. And that's obviously our main way of getting, only way of getting water as well at the beginning, because there was no flowing water. Later on, we managed to get some flowing water out of the burns. And that made it a lot easier and meant we used up a lot less fuel than we would have otherwise. Next slide, please. And getting there was really interesting. We did have to fly, unlike the people of old. And there is actually an airport in Svalbard, which helps matters. And it's in the main place called Longyearbyen. Next slide, please. And once we're there, we hired, this is effectively a taxi that the Norwegians use to get around. And they towed a fair bit of our equipment behind them, and we had stashed some equipment from the previous year as well, because it had been a series of expeditions that we had done, and we'd gradually built up the amount of kit. So this was a great way of getting across nice frozen fjords and so on. Much easier, as I said, to travel about in the winter or the springtime than it is during the melt. Next slide, please. And of course, unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to use huskies, but that is a big way of getting around, and a really lovely way of getting around. And then come the melt, you can see in the top right there that we use rubber dinghies. And at the end of our expedition, towards the middle to the end of May, that's what we used to get around a little bit more and get out of the remote base camp that we were in. We used rubber dinghies. So an absolute huge variety of different ways of traveling around, including our own skiing, using our own modes of transport. So I'm not sure that we can't think of another mode of transport that we could have used, and it was really good to be able to do all that different way. Next slide, please. And this is a map of where we were, a fairly remote part of Svalbard, and it shows the base camp that we were in, also the biology camp that we had next to the sea, where we could study all the various sea mammals, and also the glacier camp up the glen and into the glacier there, which meant that we had various different groups around about Svalbard, which meant that we had lots of different, because we had all these different science projects going on all at the same time. But it was always good to get back to base camp and meet up with all our various pals when we did get the chance to do that. Next slide, please. And of course, accommodation there, you can't go to the Arctic without building an igloo. So we had great fun doing that on our odd rest day that we had. Next slide. But for the most part, of course, we stayed in tents. These were specially made tents, quasars, which were quite strong material, and also you'll see on the bottom there that there are black valances, and that stops the snow getting through. I've certainly used normal tents in Scotland and had spindrift all the way in, and it does find its way through all crevices rather. So the valances are fantastic things if you really are going to do snowy camps, and you can use the lights of skis and so on to keep them down. And generally they will stay in place, but you do have to make sure that they're weighed down with fairly heavy stuff inside as well. And we ended up losing one tent, unfortunately, because it was a study tent that we were using for the geese colony that we were studying. And in between changing shifts, somebody had forgotten to weigh it down with rocks, and it went bowling across the Arctic, which was a bit of a shame. Luckily, our Norwegian colleagues eventually found it and picked it up, so we weren't littering the place, which was really helpful. Next slide, please. And yeah, we managed to make some fairly large igloos and had a bit of communal time, which was really nice. And given that the youngsters there were coming back from living in the smaller tents, it was really good to have a sort of base camp and a bit more of communal time. Next slide, please. And we spent a fair bit of time on skis, as I said. This is us actually skiing a wee bit on the sea ice. I'm afraid I wasn't going to let the youngsters go too far out. I had worked in the Antarctic, and one of the main dangers is sea ice going off into the sea, and quite a few people have been lost on it. So I generally kept them quite close to land. But it was an amazing place to be able to go onto and ski on that. And you can see how much easier it is to ski on sea ice than it is to be in landing way up and down mountains, all nice and flat and lovely, and absolutely stunning scenery. And you can see the sea in the background there. Next slide, please. As I said before, we studied geese to an extent, and this was us studying the geese moving around and also various other birds, and we had lots of different projects going on around there. Next slide, please. And one of the projects we had was to go and study some fulmars. This was a sea cliffs that the previous expedition had gone to, and to count fulmars. So we were wanting to replicate their science, and it involved a trip across a big delta, which I was really worried was going to melt, because it was fine to get across when it was frozen, but if it had melted, we'd have been really, really stuck. But this was a wonderful place to go and count the fulmars. And next slide, please. Because it was a real adventure to get there, as I say, getting across this delta and then through a lovely canyon, and then sitting counting the fulmars in their wee nests, which you can see the holes there in the cliffs. And it was an absolutely fantastic project to be able to go about. Next slide, please. And as you'll know, if you ever go to Orkney, or if you live in Orkney, you'll see plenty of fulmars, and they're absolutely stunning birds with lots of really fantastic characteristics. And they can live up to around 40 years or so. So it's well worth counting them and making sure that we know how many of them are around, because of all the different things that are changing. We need to have a good lot of science about them to make sure or hope that they're still remaining as many as there always are. Next slide, please. Another thing we were studying in Svalbard, but obviously not from the sea, were reindeer. And the reindeer in Svalbard are actually quite different from the sort of vast herds that you imagine roaming across the Arctic. These ones are adapted because they can't actually go across there isn't enough sea ice for them to be able to go elsewhere. So they generally stay in the islands of Svalbard. So they've actually got extra thick insulated fur compared to other reindeer. And they tend to go around in smaller groups. They're absolutely brilliant animals for getting close to. And if you sit quiet, they will actually come up to you and wonder what on earth you are. When you see them in the distance, though, they scarily look quite like polar bears. So they always give you a wee bit of a fright when you're around. Next slide, please. From a distance, as I say, yeah, they do look a bit like polar bears, but obviously if you catch them in the right light, you can see the antlers, so luckily they're not. Next slide, please. And again, next. Another indigenous inhabitant of Svalbard are ptarmigans, which we're quite familiar in Scotland, although in Scotland they are generally only found in the sort of Arctic parts of the Cairngorms and higher mountains, but here they're low down. And one of the things we found that we think we had a theory from our science was that they generally are, we think they might be quite symbiotic with reindeer. The reindeer will scrape away the snow to be able to get down to the lichen. And we quite often found ptarmigan round about where the reindeer have been scraping. And we think that the ptarmigan will also eat that lichen and use the reindeer scrapings to be able to get in there. And actually, one of the other things we found was that there were quite a lot of dead reindeer around, and we wondered that there had been a big melt in February, and then it had refrozen, and you can see ice in this picture here, which is unusual because usually it will just stay at snow. And that ice, we think, had made it hard for the reindeer to scrape away to get to the lichen. So there was quite a lot more fatalities that year than there were normally. And although we didn't see many carcasses of the ptarmigan, I wonder if there might have been similar sort of fatalities with them as well. Next slide, please. And this is an image of fox, which is more, you see them quite often in the distance because there's a big history of hunting in Svalbard. As I said before, there's a human history there. So they are quite wary of humans and tend to keep out the road. But this was our hide at the goose colony, and they generally predated on the geese eggs. So you did see them around, but they would give us a wide berth. Next slide, please. Another fantastic animal, which we're familiar with in Scotland, is the Arctic skua. Aid, the engineer, the chief leader, he was in the RAF, and he reckoned that these were the tornadoes of the bird world. And if you've ever seen a aerial display of them, are absolutely fantastic. But stunning birds to see and count there. Next slide, please. And of course, everyone's favourite, the Taminori, puffins there as well. Although actually my favourite, being called Alison and shortened to Ali, was the little logs, whose Latin name is Ali Ali, but that's by the way. We do all like puffins and Taminoris. And again, we did some projects in counting them and looking at some of their feeding patterns as well. Next slide, please. And again. And we were there mainly, say, there to study geese, and it was incredible to know that the main goose that we were studying were barnacle geese. Next slide, please. And we were also looking at various different migrants coming in, including the barnacle geese and also the likes of sandpipers and so on, and trying to get the first date when they actually came in, which is really useful phenological knowledge for the scientists for Svalbard. Next slide, please. And red phalaropes were one of the absolutely stunning birds that came in, and we managed to get the first sighting of one, I think on the 1st of May, something like that, which was tremendous. Next slide. And one of the other things we were studying was fossils, which was fantastic to be able to do. And quite a lot of really amazing fossils have been found in Svalbard because of the mainly sedimentary nature of the rock, and the fact that a lot of the stuff that's at the surface is from the Carboniferous era. Next slide, please. And it's one way of getting youngsters really interested in geology. Well, another way of doing it, and the fossils were absolutely fascinating from all of us. This promised we were looking at fossils and we weren't on our hands and knees from climbing the mountain. We were, by that time, reasonably fit from expedition life. Next slide, please. And of course, plants, although there aren't that many there and not a huge amount of vegetation, those that are there are absolutely fantastic. And we actually got quite good at identifying sort of dormant plants as well with the winter vegetation. But it was lovely when it actually did come through in the springtime towards the end of our expedition. Next slide, please. And I was mentioning the barnacle geese, and they're actually called barnacle geese, I think, because people thought before we knew about migration that they, in the winter time, this is from the UK, they would, sorry, in the summertime, they would disappear into the ocean and become goose barnacles. So that there's sort of a link between those two, but actually eventually it turned out that the barnacle geese disappeared off to various different places in the Arctic to be able to breed, because there's such good breeding grounds there. And before we went to Svalbard, we went to visit a particular flock in Dumfries and Galloway in Caerlaverock, and they're the ones that actually go to Svalbard. And amazingly enough, one of the birds we saw in Caerlaverock in Scotland, we saw it again in Svalbard. So it was really, really exciting to see that in real life. Next slide, please. And we were able to view the geese through the telescope here and be able to then pick up on their ringed legs. They had rings around their legs, so that's how we knew it was the same goose. We didn't quite get the skills of being able to distinguish between each one, although that'd be a good one to be able to have. Next slide, please. And they are stunning birds, and it was fantastic to be able to watch them in their breeding grounds and also pairing up on the cliffs here as well. Next slide. And although we were basing most of our studies around the seas of Svalbard, we did have a look at the glaciers as well, because they're obviously contributing to supplying the sea with water and potential sea level rise and all the issues around climate change as well. So this was one of our ways of studying the glacier, and obviously we're all keeping safe by being on ropes, because with glaciers go crevasses. And we really don't want to fall down one of those. Next slide, please. And we use GPS systems to be able to study the glacier, how much it was moving and so on. Next slide. And also a bit of manual labour as well. Science isn't just all tech kit. We had to dig right down and find out whether there was ice there or not, because that's part of the definition of a glacier. And we actually found that the glaciers had receded quite a lot, and we were able to look at previous maps and find out where they'd been and produce some new maps for that particular glacier, which was really exciting to be able to do. Next slide, please. And that's a view of some of the ice that we managed to dig right down to. Next slide. And those glaciers melt off and increase the river flow. This was obviously after we had done the Fulmore colony expedition. Everything was starting to melt by this time, and we were back to sort of more Scottish conditions, where our skis were more like water skiing than snow skiing. But it did give us a really good chance to be able to measure the melt flow off the glaciers. And again, we had some good flow meters, and the student there is doing a really good study on that. Next slide, please. And the next one again. And the next few slides are really just to give you an overview of the expedition and some nice pictures, and just to show you what an amazing, fantastic place it is that I was very lucky to be able to get to. And hopefully you'll enjoy the next few. And if we would just go through a few slides for the next wee while. As an ex-meteorologist, this was great to see, to be able to set these up. And some plant monitoring going on, a little quadrat. I mentioned about reindeer going on, and this was during the melt. We started to have to travel by foot rather than using the skis and the poles. You can see how much kit we have to carry, about 30 kilos worth each. And this is communicating back to base, make sure we're all safe and everybody knows what's happening. And of course, it's not all good weather. You tend to take pictures in good weather, but we had a fair few storms as well. It wouldn't be the Arctic with a good amount of snow. And a bit of safety training, mountaineering, so that we can all go up and down and view things. We just hold fire a little bit here. I'd mentioned polar bears, and although they're absolutely brilliant beasts, when we were on foot, we really did have to take care, because being part of the food chain, not generally used to it in Scotland other than being midge fodder, but polar bears obviously would prey on humans if they get a chance and they're hungry. So we did have to put measures into place to be able to defend ourselves. Obviously, the rifle was very much a last ditch measure, and of course we didn't have to use it, thank goodness. Next slide, please. Generally, and you can see from the size of the footprint here, really didn't want any encounters with them at all. Next slide. And one of the measures we used was a tripwire to make sure that the polar bears, we could hear the polar bears, and if we did hear them coming through, they would go through this tripwire and set off a loud bang, and that would scare them off. If that didn't scare them off, we also had flares, so that would set them off as well. Next slide, please. And we knew it worked because there was one group of scientists that came through late, and I heard them coming in late. They were saying, "Shh, everybody quiet." And I thought, oh, here we go. Next thing we knew, they'd set off the tripwire because they'd forgotten about it. So it gave us a good chance to go into our polar bear routine. We all banged our pots, set off our flares, and scared the living daylights out of our colleagues, which was great fun. Next slide. And how to go about doing their daily function. I found when I had youngsters there, it was a great way of encouraging them to get up and be ready at exactly the right time, because whoever was late had to carry the poo bag, because we obviously had to clear away all our mess. So less said about that, the better. Next slide, please. And going to the loo could be quite dodgy as well, because polar bears are the Arctic. The Latin name is Ursus maritimus, and therefore they're very good swimmers. So if you did happen to go down to the beach for a number 2, you generally had to have somebody protecting you just in case. So yes, not much privacy when you're on expedition quite often. Next slide. But a good chance to have a fire. And one of the amazing things about the seas around Svalbard is that a lot of the driftwood that comes around is actually from Siberia. So it gives you a chance to be able to study the currents that go around there, and there's a lot of history around it as well. And some of the driftwood was 100 years old. You'll see in this picture we actually picked some new stuff so that we could study the old stuff. But it was lovely to have a fire and to be able to dry our wet socks off. Next slide. And again, just some amazing pictures to show the enormity and scale of the landscape that you go through there, and that sort of liminal link with the sea. You almost can't tell whether you're on land and sea sometimes. Next slide. As you can see from here. And the amazing qualities of water. So thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Alison, for a fascinating talk. What an amazing place. I just love the dramatic scenery, and I think I was quite surprised by the variety of mammals and birds that you had there for such a, harsh environment. We've actually got quite a few questions for you.
Okay.
We'll start off Richard Oakley. He's got a few here. He's asking, he said that polar bear numbers declined. You said that they declined. What did they decline from and to? And this is interesting because they've increased in other areas.
I'm not sure because I'm a physicist, so I'm not as up to date with all the polar bear numbers as I probably should be. But my impression from what I was reading was that they declined in all over. But actually, there are more interactions with human beings now because there's less sea ice, and therefore the polar bears don't have as much access to their main food, which is seals, ringed seals and bearded seals. So the polar bears are beginning to ingress on the likes of Longyearbyen, or in Canada, for instance, they're coming into some of the Arctic towns. So I might be wrong, but I think they're decreasing everywhere, but it might be the impression they're increasing because they're coming into human habitation much more.
That's great. And we've got Swain. He says, what evidence, if any, of climate change were you able to observe comparing to your, over your 2 expeditions?
Yeah, over 2 expeditions, it's quite hard, but our small amount of information you wouldn't be able to come to a proper conclusion. But because our information was added to the great body of evidence, of scientific evidence, we played a small part in providing some of that evidence. So if you add it all up, you can see that there is a lot of evidence of climate change. And from what we could see there, you could see that the glacier itself had receded for one. Flows off the glacier, water flows off the glaciers were bigger, even in a relatively short time, and the sea ice had reduced as well, and seasons had changed. And as I say, you probably can't take an absolute proof from our small part, but when you add up all that evidence, it is clear and unequivocal the climate change is happening there as well.
Yeah, okay. We've got Carrie from Inverness. She says, how long did it take to build the igloo and how many people could you fit inside?
Yeah, the natives can build them really quickly in an hour or two. It took us all day. The wee one that we had there, you could get 5 folk in, or a couple of folk for sleeping. And the big one we built, we could get, I think we managed to get 12 people in as a wee communal thing.
That's
So,
good.
yeah, good fun. We weren't very good at it, I'm afraid. It takes practice.
Particularly not practice.
Mm.
We've had some interesting talks about Northern sheep and seaweed in the Science Festival, and Swain was asking, is there any parallels between the Svalbard reindeer and the Northern sheep, you know, because they're foraging?
Not that we could see, and not that I could think of. I think they probably avoided going down to the beach partly because of the potential for polar bear predation. They generally feed on lichen, so I haven't heard of any feeding on seaweed. But as I said, I'm really a physicist and not a biologist, so you never know. I have to keep an eye out for that.
Okay, just one last quick question. How many days of permanent darkness does Svalbard experience? That's from Richard.
Good question. It depends which bit of Svalbard you're in. Say it's the size of Ireland, so it sort of covers a fair swathe there. But we went there in April so that we could get light, because it's pretty well permanently dark from around November to February. But I'd probably have to look up the actual numbers. And I've got my book here, but I'll let other folk look that up to be absolutely sure.
Okay, that's all.
But it would be good to go for the darkness as well, because the Northern Lights, the Aurora Borealis, would be fantastic.
Oh yes, because you'll have no light pollution there whatsoever. Okay, I think we've lost Alison. I just wanted to thank her and also our technical team for all your work behind the scenes. And our PD Kurt lunches still have some spaces. Please find the links under each lunch description on our website if you want to relax and come and have a chat at one of the virtual tables. And some of the festival speakers should be there. And if you'd like to carry on the conversation and join us in the festival club later tonight, the link's in the live chat. And if you're enjoying the festival, please follow us, follow our channel on YouTube and like our Facebook page. So thank you again, Alison, and good evening, folks.
Thank you.